In 1909, the discovery of a young woman, pale and emaciated, lying lifeless in a bathtub, marked the start of an investigation into what seemed like a tragic story with a bleak ending. Just beneath the surface, however, lurked something far darker. As investigators pulled back the curtain, they uncovered a twisted tale of manipulation, greed and murder. At its heart, the eerie, calculating Wardlaw sisters, a trio of eccentric aunts who wore nothing but black. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories Season 9, Episode 5. I'm Ben, your host as always, and it's good to be back. This week we've got, I really don't know how to describe it, but I think what is quite amazing is after all these years of doing Dark Histories, I still discover stories that just have so many twists and turns and can just completely baffle me. And you would think you'd seen it all, right? But this story is, well, it's really something. So yeah, let's jump straight into it. There's nothing else really for me to mention at the start of the show, so let's jump into it. This is The Strange Death of Ocey Snead, the East Orange Bathtub Mystery. On the rugged eastern coast of Scotland, where the steel-cold wind whips off the North Sea to carve stone from harsh cliffs, the University of St Andrews' St Salvator's Cathedral sits proud in the town of St Andrews, a monument of medieval Gothic cobble and fog. Founded in 1413 by Henry Wardlaw, a Scottish bishop with ancient Saxon roots, the school was the first university in the country and the third oldest in the English-speaking world. As the rubble stone building cemented itself as the centre of the country's learning, so too did Henry Wardlaw see his name cemented in history. 300 years later, William Wardlaw, a direct descendant of Henry, arrived in Pennsylvania with his father from the Old World, among the first of the Wardlaws to set foot in the young, exciting country, where he arrived amongst large numbers of Scotch-Irish Presbyterians who had made their way across the Atlantic throughout the 1720s. Eventually moving south and settling in Virginia, the Wardlaw family name quickly became synonymous with wealth and success throughout the South. The cardinals and barons of Scottish history had marched into the Enlightenment, crossed oceans, and emerged as bankers, merchants, clergy, surgeons, and officials, with a name that would continue to command respect, spreading to South Carolina and beyond. In military history, there are several Wardlaws who made their mark on history while serving as officers during the American Revolutionary War, gaining independence from the British and ensuring that their families could continue to thrive as proud Southern Americans. In peacetime, they were lawyers, governors, judges, and landowners. Unsurprisingly then, with such strong roots across the entirety of the southern states and with a vested interest in the profits of their plantations, the Wardlaw family name crops up throughout the Civil War as generals, majors, and lieutenants of the Confederate Army. The family tree of this era reads much like an adventure novel, with Wardlaws being shredded by rifle fire, yet making rapid recoveries, or escaping imprisonment by floating down the Mississippi. Honest, manly, brave, and generous, a man of unusual integrity and strength of character, the superlatives go on, in a list almost as long as the family history itself. Once the war was over, the name continued to spread, and eventually it found its way to New York, where, much as before, its bearers were teachers and school principals, accountants, financiers, and store owners. Arguably, however, amongst such a long and storied family history, it is the strange life and utterly unglamorous death of Virginia Wardlaw that holds the greatest infamy, or is, in the very least, the most heavily documented, though all for reasons which were far from the Wardlaw ideal. In 1909, East Orange, a city in Essex County, New Jersey, just west over the river from Manhattan, was a sprawling residential neighbourhood already showing signs of the refined middle-class community it would come to be known for during the pre-war period. Main Street, lined with trees and ornate electric streetlights, was home to long rows of detached two-storey houses, department stores, and the East Orange Police Headquarters, an intimidating three-storey building fronted with a large veranda. Sergeant Timothy Caniff was on duty on the afternoon of the 29th of November 1909 when a strange call came in from a woman requesting a coroner's visit to her home at 89 North 14th Street, where she said there had been an accident. Essex County not having a coroner, the sergeant forwarded the message on to a physician, Dr. Herbert Simmons, who made his way over to the 3 blocks from his office to the good-sized two-storey wood-framed house and knocked on the door. To his surprise, a woman came to greet him, dressed in black from head to foot, including a long black cape and several heavy black veils covering her face. As she ushered the doctor into the house, she introduced herself as Virginia Wardlaw, and then hastily directed him upstairs towards the bathroom. Inside the house, the doctor noticed that there seemed to be very little furniture in any of the rooms, all of which were shrouded in dim light, the windows being covered with large sheets of muslin. When they reached the bathroom, Mrs. Wardlaw opened the door and the doctor stepped inside. Sitting in a half-filled bath was the body of a young woman, her head on its side, just beneath the waterline, right below the faucet. Her left hand was holding a small washcloth, and on the floor, her clothing lay crumpled in a small pile with a note pinned on top. Taking it carefully, he read the scrawled handwriting. "Last year, my daughter died. The other near and dear ones have gone before. I have been prostrated with illness for a long time. When you read this, I will have committed suicide. Do not grieve over me. Rejoice with me that death brings a blessed relief from pain and suffering greater than I can bear." The note was signed Ocey Snead. Turning back to Virginia Wardlaw, Dr. Simmons questioned the woman on the situation, who told him that Oceana Ocey Wardlaw Martin Snead was her niece, who had been suffering since her child had died about a year earlier. Shortly after this, her husband had left her and was almost certainly dead, and her most recent child, a 4-month-old son, was currently in the hospital in Brooklyn. She had found Ocey's body that afternoon, shortly before she called the police. This might have all sounded perfectly acceptable, but Dr. Simmons was fairly sure that the woman had been dead for at least 24 hours already. In a way of explanation, Virginia said that yesterday evening, Ocey had asked her to heat the water for her to have a bath, and then, having asked to be left alone, she left the house in order to attend to business. Still somewhat confused, Dr. Simmons asked if they had lived alone in the large house, which Virginia confirmed, saying that their living there was only expected to be temporary. The doctor left the house with a deep feeling that something was not quite right. He called the station and confirmed that the young girl, Ocey, had been a victim of apparent suicide, but that he felt it suspicious enough to require the visit of a detective. It was already dark when Sergeant William O'Neill made his way up to the front door later that evening. Just as before, Virginia Wardlaw opened the front door to the officer wearing her full black garb. O'Neill explained that he'd been sent to inspect the house, and Virginia, somewhat reluctantly, stepped aside and then led him up to the bathroom. Inside, the house was now almost pitch black, with only dim light from a gas lamp filtering through a few of the rooms. The bathroom was exactly as the doctor had described, with the naked body of Ocey still sitting in the bath. Seeing enough, O'Neill then asked Virginia to show him the rest of the house. Silently, the two walked through the dark hallway to the attic rooms, all of which were completely empty. On the second floor, all of the rooms except one were also entirely undecorated, with just a few badly positioned sheets of muslin hanging over the windows. In one room, a single silk gown hung in an otherwise empty closet. The one room that seemed to have any signs of life at all was towards the front of the house, which contained a small bed that Virginia explained had belonged to Ocey. By the pillow, O'Neill found a locket containing a photo of a baby and a small strand of hair. A pair of shoes sat unused on the floor, and in the corner, a blackened silk gown hung on the wall. In one corner, a small barrel had been covered with a cloth and converted into a makeshift dressing table covered with combs and hairpins. In the other corner sat a single cereal packet amongst a few empty cans of evaporated milk. All across the floor, orange peel was scattered and discarded. The only decoration in the whole room was a faded photo of a ballerina that hung on the rear wall. If the upper floors had felt somewhat austere to O'Neill, the ground floor was thoroughly bleak. No furniture stood in any of the rooms, aside from a few makeshift pieces dotted throughout. A table had been improvised by placing a plank of wood on an empty box, and a chair sat without legs, propped up on a packing crate. The kitchen was filthy and appeared unused for some time, and in an empty cellar there was an old coal heater that stood covered in ash. The whole place seemed utterly out of place to O'Neill, who had gathered from Virginia's demeanour that she was a woman of some means, and yet here she was, living in absolute squalor. Turning his attention away from the house for a moment, O'Neill questioned Virginia further on the details that she had given the doctor earlier that afternoon. And finding her not exactly forthcoming, she told him much of the same story that she had given the doctor, and that she had not realised Ocey had died due to her having asked not to be disturbed. And when he pressed her for details on Ocey's past, it seemed to the officer that she was evading giving any concrete answers at all, though he did discover that the pair had only moved into the East Orange house 10 days earlier, moving from the Flatlands area of Brooklyn, and Virginia had been sleeping on the floor since her arrival. When he asked her why they had moved, she gave the rather strange reply, given the state of the house, that they'd moved there for Ocey's health. When he realised that he was getting nowhere particularly fast, O'Neill explained to the old woman that she would need to accompany him to the police station, where they could ask for a few more questions. Expecting a fuss, he was somewhat relieved when she nodded silently, following him out of the house with her handbag already over one arm. Back at the station, Virginia was handed over to the Chief of Police, James Bell, who took over the questioning in an effort to try and ascertain precisely what the strangely dressed lady knew about her niece's death. By the time he was through, it was almost midnight, and he felt he had learned almost nothing. It seemed to Bell that Mrs. Wardlaw was withholding plenty of information, but her reasons for doing so were anything but clear. One thing he did know was that the whole thing was certainly as suspicious as the doctor had suggested. Concluding the questions for the day, he informed Virginia that she would be held as a material witness and transferred to a cell in Essex County Jail in Newark. The next day, Ocey's body was removed from the East Orange house and transported to the morgue, where the county physician, Dr. William Mackenzie, carried out a full autopsy. Through his examination, he was able to conclude that Ocey had been alive when she had got in the bathtub due to a small amount of water in her lungs, and that her cause of death had officially been drowning. At the same time, however, he noted that she only weighed 80 pounds, and her body had been badly emaciated, and had almost certainly been starving for quite some time. When he handed the results over to Bell, they only confirmed his unease that something very strange had happened in the East Orange house, and so, with Virginia still locked up, he went door to door with his officers, questioning the neighbours on the house, its occupants, and if they had seen or heard anything unusual on the night of Ocey's death. Most could not furnish the police with any stories about the house's occupants at all, though one or two said they rarely saw lights on in the house, except for the Sunday night of Ocey's death, when the second-floor lights were on all night. A local restaurateur recognised the description of Virginia, noting that a woman dressed in black would frequent his establishment alone in order to order oysters. The only other story came from a cabbie who had taxied Virginia and Ocey from the station on the day they moved in, and he said that he felt Ocey had looked rather sickly. Overall, it seemed the two women's presence in the neighbourhood had been one with very little footprint. The local East Orange doctor had ventured out to the house on one occasion and had his own strange story, telling the police that an elderly lady dressed all in black, with her face covered in a black veil, had visited his surgery late one night in order to ask him to visit the house and supply a health certificate for Ocey. At first, reluctant to go at such a late hour, the woman's insistence broke him down, and he ventured out to the East Orange residence in order to examine the young girl, finding that she was weak and prone to bronchitis, but otherwise in good physical health, though he did suggest that they heat the cold house now and then before he left. In reply, the older woman, presumably Virginia, told him that they were only planning on staying for a short while. Still unsure that the two women had lived alone, Bell next contacted the rental agency to see if he could find out anything about who had rented the house. Over the phone, he discovered that they had dealt with a young girl matching the description of Ocey, and a second, older woman who, curiously, despite having dressed head to foot in black clothing, otherwise appeared to not match the description of Virginia. The pair, the agency said, had collected the keys on the house and paid $14 in rent up front. Hoping to dig more into their background, the police's next stop was to head over to the Flatlands house in Brooklyn, which they had learned was on East 48th Street, and they hoped they might be able to ascertain something from the neighbours there. Fortunately, the East 48th Street tenants seemed to have left behind quite a reputation, and people were more than happy to talk. Just like the East Orange house, the East 48th address was rumoured to be completely unfurnished and showed signs that whoever had lived there had been living in just as much squalor. Most of the neighbours knew that a pretty young girl had lived there, but it was the other residents that they spoke about more often. 2 or possibly 3 other women had lived at the house along with her, though no one was quite sure on how many exactly, as they said they always came and went at night, and they always wore full black attire and shielded their faces with heavy black veils. The shutters on the house's windows had always been closed, and those that had no shutters were covered in sheets of material. Locally, the house was known as the House of Mystery. On some nights, people said that they could see the woman in black burning refuse in the back garden, and others even said that they heard strange noises coming from within the walls. An interesting story reached the police from a midwife named Ethel Moore, who claimed to have helped deliver Ocey's second child, and throughout the labour, Ocey was said to have complained that she was being starved to death. Looking to discover details past the local rumours, police contacted the janitor, who bought the keys and let them in to show them around. Inside was little different from East Orange, with bare rooms, makeshift furniture, and only a few empty cans of evaporated milk in the kitchen. Every room seemed to show signs of decay and disrepair, and large ominous dark patches on the carpet gave reason to contact the doctors. The most grim discovery came from the kitchen, when an officer uncovered a bone stashed within a bundle of blonde hair that looked disturbingly like they had come from a child. During this tour of the house, the janitor gave his own take on the women that had lived there, saying that Ocey, who he knew to have been around 24 years old, and her husband, a man named Fletcher, who he described as a refined southern gentleman, had moved in 18 months ago. Several months later, they had been joined by 2 older women, and then a third shortly after, all 3 of which had dressed constantly in black. Continuing on, he told the police that Fletcher had left around March and Ocey had had a baby in August. The family had struggled with paying the $25 rent for a long time and had been close to being evicted on several occasions, before one of the older women would swoop in and pay the back rent in cash at the last minute. This cycle seemed to continue until November, when the agency got sick of their late payments and finally kicked them out. Whilst the stories seemingly just opened up more and more questions, the janitor did clear up one mystery, when he explained that all of their belongings were sent to a storage warehouse in Brooklyn shortly before they were evicted. Through Ethel Moore, the midwife, the police next spoke to Dr. William Petit, who had visited the house in Brooklyn several times to treat Ocey. On all occasions, he had seen 2 other women there dressed fully in black that he knew to be her aunts, as well as a third woman in black, along with an elderly woman who showed up sporadically. Strangely, he noted that there was only ever one bed, used by Ocey, in the whole house. Ocey, he said, had been suffering from general weakness as a result of poor nutrition, and at the time of his visit, he had suggested feeding a proper diet, as well as prescribing medication and fresh air. When he followed up on his appointments, and it became apparent that no efforts had been made to address any of his suggestions, one of Ocey's aunts had told him that they had not been able to afford any of the care. When the baby was born in August, he had been sickly, but overall in good health, and he was not entirely sure why Ocey's aunts had placed the baby in the hospital at all. A nurse, Mrs. Elizabeth Mogg, was employed for a short while, but was quickly shooed away by the aunts. The doctor had, for a time, considered that Ocey's weakness had been the result of poisoning or drug use, and had reported the household to the authorities, who, after consideration, decided that there was nothing illegal going on, and failed to carry out any follow-ups. Following his report, Petit felt he was unwelcome in the house, so he stopped attending entirely. The doctor had assumed that this report to the authorities may have actually been the reason why they'd eventually moved out of the area. Petit then followed the police back to the Brooklyn house, where he thankfully confirmed that the stains on the carpet were from tobacco rather than blood, and that the bundle of bone and hair found in the kitchen had actually belonged to a small animal rather than a child. Following on from the doctor, the police next contacted the nurse, Elizabeth Mogg, who said that Ocey's aunts would never leave the two of them alone together, and always hovered around her, ensuring that she could not speak to Ocey, who she was sure was acting as though she was afraid of something. The police then called the hospital and confirmed that Ocey's baby had been admitted by the aunts and was currently still there, but that his medical fees had never been paid. During their investigation, the police had also discovered that Ocey had recently made out her will to an attorney, and when they spoke to him, he confirmed that Ocey had signed the document, dictated to him by her aunt, on account of the new baby being born. Within the document, Ocey left $500 to her infant son, whilst everything else, including 3 properties in Virginia, Ohio and Georgia, worth a total of $16,000, were to be left to her grandmother, Martha Elizabeth Wardlaw, who was also to act as executrix. At the same time, police also discovered that Ocey's aunts had life insurance policies out for the young girl, totaling $20,000, which had already been heavily borrowed on. For Bell, the life insurance policy finally gave him a clue as to a motive. But in many respects, his trip out to Brooklyn had left him just as in the dark as he had been before. Meanwhile, whilst Bell had been digging around Ocey and her aunt's old haunts, Detective Harry Riker had been combing over the East Orange property. In the cellar, he had found a newspaper dated on the day of Ocey's death, along with a collection of life insurance policy documents, all with Ocey's grandmother, Martha Eliza Wardlaw, as the beneficiary. Curiously, he had not managed to find a single pen or pot of ink in the whole house, leading him to question quite how the suicide note had been written at all. He also discovered that there had been no fires lit in the kitchen stove for many weeks, directly contradicting Virginia's story that she had heated the bath water for Ocey before leaving the house on the evening of her death. Other curious oddities that he had noticed was the lack of any bath towels in the bathroom. In many respects, he found suspicion in the things that were missing from the house, rather than the things that he had discovered. With all this talk of neglect, insurance policies and wills, Bell decided to pull the trigger, and he arrested Virginia Wardlaw for the murder of Ocey Snead. Following the arrest of Virginia Wardlaw, the press pounced on a story absolutely rife with suspicion and rumour. Unfortunately, many ran with the more spurious elements of the story, such as child's bones and bloodstains having been found in the Brooklyn house, or that Ocey, having been often seen in a daze, was being hypnotised by her wicked aunts, so that within a day, the integrity of the entire investigation was being called into question. Still, the story had enough excitement to bring out hundreds of fantastic witness accounts of the House of Mystery that the papers were naturally happy to insert into their stories at every opportunity. Mrs. Lydia Kane said that on one occasion, Virginia Wardlaw had inquired about renting her house, asking specifically if it had a big bathtub. When she came to view the house, fully decked out in her black clothing of course, she apparently refused it on account of the bathroom being too small. Similar stories came from their neighbours in Brooklyn. Joseph Johnson said that he had been called in to photograph the baby before it had been sent off to hospital, and found the interior of the house so dark that he had not been able to get a sufficient image. A lawyer, Julius Caraba, said that a heavily veiled woman dressed in black had visited him and offered him an investment opportunity whereby he could expect to gain $100 for every $1 that he put in. The opportunity turned out to be him altering a will. Agreeing in principle, he visited the Brooklyn house alongside his partner, Charles Schwartzman, in the middle of the night, just as the woman had ordered. Caraba said that he was taken to see Ocey, who was lying in a bed looking emaciated. In the room, another woman in black entered, and the two of them apparently began chanting from a Bible. Realising that Ocey needed medical attention more than legal attention, Caraba refused to continue with the alteration and wrote one of the women in black a cheque in order to pay for a doctor to visit Ocey. When the women left the room, he said that Ocey suddenly sprang up in her bed, grabbed him by the arm, and begged him to take her away from the house, saying that her aunts were starving her. Pulling a second will from beneath her pillow, she thrust it into his hand and told him to make himself and his partner executors and to look after her baby, with her baby and her grandma to receive her full estate. With this, the women returned and Ocey fell back on the bed, silent. The two women in black then assured him that if he altered Ocey's will to make her aunts the executors rather than her grandma, who was too old to be a beneficiary, they argued, they would give him 2 insurance policies on Ocey's life worth a total of $7,000. Caraba said that he would do nothing more until a doctor could be called in. Reluctantly, the old women agreed, and Dr. Waxman soon arrived, examined Ocey and scolded the woman in black for neglecting the young woman, laying out a care plan and a diet for her recovery. Meanwhile, whilst the doctor was examining Ocey, the 2 lawyers had made themselves busy creeping through the house, away from the women in black. Downstairs, they felt sure they could hear footsteps in the lounge, but the door was locked. When they returned, Caraba insisted he speak with a grandma, who should be the beneficiary, and when the sisters denied him, he decided to leave, realising that the whole deal was far from above board. As wild as this story sounded, it was soon confirmed by another reporter who tracked down Dr. Waxman, who corroborated the story. With so much intense storytelling in the papers, Virginia Wardlaw's official arraignment on Wednesday the 1st of December drew huge crowds that blocked the entrance to the City Hall in a hope to catch a glimpse of the strange woman dressed in black. Even if anyone had managed to bustle to the front of the mob, they would have seen very little, as Virginia was still insisting on wearing veils to cover her face. Even when she made it inside the courtroom, she refused to remove them, only lifting them momentarily in order for the recorder to identify her, whereby she held her hands on either side of her face, shielding it from view from anyone else in the room. The arraignment was a relatively swift affair, and Virginia was promptly charged with murder by drowning in order for profit, and then carted back off to prison. The whole affair had been a scene of some chaos, but it did have one positive effect for Virginia when a young lawyer named Franklin Fort sprung from the crowd and offered his services as a defence counsel, which she promptly accepted, having him escort her through the crowds as his first duty. Meanwhile, police were beginning to follow their leads concerning the life insurance policies, which they found a total of 7, all taken out on Ocey's life between 1900 and 1909. 3 were taken with Equitable, and 4 with the New York Life Insurance Company for a total of $24,000. Checking in with the companies themselves, the New York Life Insurance Company were immediately familiar with the policies, saying that on numerous occasions, multiple documents had been issued which had long since thrown up flags for them, suggesting that the policyholder may have been securing multiple undocumented loans against their value. Virginia Wardlaw had actually been in touch on several occasions to inquire about some of the details on the policies, and the depth of her knowledge had also thrown up red flags. Police quickly found that the women in black had been securing these loans by touting a tale of good people falling on hard times, and then using the policies to secure a great deal of goods, services and cash, including doctors' visits and bank loans. It soon became abundantly clear to the investigation that Virginia was considerably more experienced at swindles than she had thus far been letting on. It now appeared to police that by the winter of 1909, despite all the best efforts of Virginia and the women in black, the policies had been squeezed of all their value, and now it seemed was the time to cash them in. With so much documentation, the police were slowly forming a picture of the women's recent activities, but they still had more questions than answers. Finding out exactly who the women in black were was high on the priority list. Several journalists had tried their best to name them, and in every case missed the mark entirely, and Virginia was still remaining tight-lipped. Fortunately, with the policy documents in hand, the investigators now had the name of Ocey's grandma, who was also mentioned in the will, the 84-year-old Martha Elizabeth Wardlaw, though they still had no idea where she was either. Following the lead that Virginia and the other women had put their possessions in storage prior to the Brooklyn eviction, detectives next contacted the Eagle Storage Company, finding nothing booked under the name Wardlaw nor Snead. Then they tried a third name, Pollock, which they had found cropping up now and then, specifically when Ocey's baby had been admitted to the hospital. And instantly, this name brought success, finding a storage unit packed full of furniture, clothing, and piles of documents and old newspaper clippings. At the same time, a doctor contacted the police with the story that a woman in black had come into his drugstore and left several large packages in his care over a number of days, and then never returned to collect them. When the police picked them up, they found even more documents inside. This stash of documents was gold for the investigation, but would take considerable time to pore through. But one of the first nuggets of information they came across was the fact that Virginia Wardlaw was not just any old lady. The Wardlaw family name was connected with one of the oldest families in the South, and was one of considerable property, wealth and respect. As exciting as this news was, it simply asked more questions, specifically on why the women appeared to be living in such squalor now if they were all so well connected. With Virginia remaining silent and continuing to claim her innocence, officers were tasked with digging through the stacks and stacks of paperwork and following all the leads one by one. As painfully dreary as the work promised to be, it turned out to yield almost immediate results. When police found a bill from a recently employed stenographer amongst all of the paperwork, they approached him for any information that he could provide, and he handed over an address in Manhattan. Dashing over there, the police spoke to the housekeeper, who confirmed that the women in black had indeed lived there. In fact, the grandma, Eliza Wardlaw, and one of the aunts, Mary Snead, were still there right now. The third aunt, she said, was named Caroline Martin. All three had been funny old women, she told the police, coming and going at all times of night, always dressed in black, with heavy veils over their faces. They never let anyone into their rooms, and locals called one of the aunts the Tramp due to her constant bustling around with a large, heavy suitcase in hand. When the police knocked on their door, they found Mary Snead in a basement room, dressed fully in black and, just like Virginia, with a heavy veil covering her face. Ocey's grandma was also there, though she appeared sickly and almost entirely blind. Just like Virginia, Mary was keen to keep quiet and said almost nothing under questioning, saying only that Virginia had always taken very good care of Ocey. Under continued pressure, however, she quickly broke down and, following a brief meltdown, assured the officers she would explain everything to them. With a sigh, she sat down and began her long asseveration. There is no mystery in this case. There was no mystery in our living in the modest Flatlands house. There was nothing to conceal except for the sake of our family and relatives, and it was for them that we have been silent until now. The reason for her and Virginia's silence, she assured the police, was not for any nefarious means, but for the natural reaction of a prideful family ashamed of their current situation, looking to protect their family name. Ocey was both Mary Snead's daughter-in-law and niece, as Ocey's husband had in fact been her first cousin. Ocey's father had been a Confederate Army colonel that had travelled to New York, where he met Ocey's mother and the third aunt, Caroline Martin. Following their marriage, and after giving birth to Ocey, they decided they wanted their daughter to grow up a Southern girl, and so they sent her to school in the South, where she had grown up as a childhood sweetheart with Mrs. Snead's son, Fletcher. After Ocey and Fletcher returned to New York, the two married and later gave birth to two children, the first passing away shortly after birth, and the second now currently in hospital. Shortly before the second birth, Fletcher had left New York, apparently for his health, though Mrs. Snead said that she was sure that he was now dead. Soon after Fletcher had left, the three aunts had moved in with Ocey in order to take care of her during her pregnancy. Throughout that time, Ocey was said to have grown more and more despondent, requesting to make her will, which Mrs. Snead assured police was under no coercion whatsoever. They had never mistreated Ocey, she said. They had always fed her and cared for her. If she did not get any fresh meat, she said, it was because she had what we had. She then told the police that she had not seen Ocey nor Virginia since their move to East Orange, which they had done to get away from the noise. She also said that she had not even heard of Ocey's death until she had read about it in the papers that very morning. As for Caroline Martin, Ocey's mother and the third aunt, Mrs. Snead said that she didn't know where she was, although curiously she added, I will not say she is dead. I will not say where she is. The fact is, I do not know. She did say that she had been a respectable teacher who had been living from a good pension. This was a long and curious speech, and at the end of it, Detective O'Neill and Riker, at a loss as to where to go next, asked Mary Snead and Grandma Wardlaw to accompany them voluntarily to the station for further questioning. Unsurprisingly, both refused, and since they could think of no crime to arrest them for, they were forced to leave, though not before they ordered officers to keep the house under surveillance. At the same time that Mary Snead was blurting out her family history to the police, Franklin Fort, Virginia's new lawyer, was busy putting together a press release that he hoped would counter some of the more extreme stories that had found their way to the papers. First and foremost, he was keen to point out that police had no evidence whatsoever on Virginia. Drowning someone in 1.5 feet of bathwater was impossible, he insisted, without their consent. The life insurance policies that the police were so excited about were all old, he said. If Virginia had wanted to profit from them, she could have done so several years earlier. Lastly, he said that there was no doubt that Ocey had been starving. The whole family were, he said, after they had fallen on such bad times. In conclusion, he said that Virginia's only offence had been her intense pride. Theirs has been one long struggle, not only against poverty, but against that poverty becoming publicly known. The lengths to which they went to keep this secret explains many things about their way of living. Miss Wardlaw would rather go to the electric chair than humble her pride by giving out details of family history that might appear discreditable in newspapers. The press conference was further bolstered by new voices emerging from around the country of people who remembered the Wardlaw family name. Respected scholars, academics, land and business owners all came out in defence, saying that they were no more refined, educated and cultured women in the whole country than Mrs. Wardlaw and her sisters. Soon, a fund was being put together to finance the care of Grandma Wardlaw, who had been moved to a home with some of the family's friends. This was a dramatic shift in tone for the three aunts to have flipped from monsters to maidens, and it certainly put a new spin on the paper's stories. But not everyone was buying it, especially the chief of police, who had been keeping himself busy digging through the ever-growing pile of documentation that filled in the picture of Ocey's life. One of the police's newest lines of inquiry was to place at least one of the aunts at the East Orange house at the time of Ocey's death. Thankfully, due to their somewhat eccentric dress code, witnesses seemed to remember seeing them quite easily. A young boy said he had seen Virginia leave the East Orange house carrying a satchel tied up with a rope on the day that she reported Ocey's death to the police, and several witnesses saw her return without the satchel. It also emerged that a strange man was seen hanging around outside the house on the night that Ocey had died. They also said that, unusually, the lights had been on in the house all night long, and they were fairly sure that they remembered seeing the shadows of a man and a woman inside. For the police, this strange man became central to their theories, who they believed Virginia had paid him to carry Ocey to the bathtub, but they would need more evidence if they were to pin down on that story. A second autopsy carried out on Ocey helped to back up this theory when the doctor concluded that Ocey would likely have been too weak to take a bath without assistance, and would certainly have needed carrying. Then, just as things were beginning to make a semblance of sense, the life insurance company's own investigation threw a spanner into the works by suggesting that the body of Ocey Snead lying in the morgue was not that of Ocey Snead at all. The prosecutor delayed Ocey's burial and instead had her embalmed. Thankfully, the life insurance company's claims were quickly mooted when Dr. Petit identified Ocey, finding that the stitches he had put in after operating on Ocey following her giving birth were still in place. He specifically remembered them, as when he had returned to remove them, the women in black had denied him entry to the house. At the same time that all of this was happening, police were also following a long string of addresses related to the aunts that showed that they had been hopping from one rented home to another for some time, always moving on when the arrears grew too high. Somewhere down the line, it seemed that the sisters had wanted to open a new school in the south, but had wound up losing all of their money and had been living in poverty for some time. And still, more and more strange stories were being uncovered. Most witnesses who had met Ocey described her as acting afraid of the women in black, and one doctor who had attended her, Cornelius Love, said that he felt sure she had been drugged with opiates. A clerk in a clothing store told the police that the women in black had come into his shop alongside Ocey and asked him to sign a copy of Ocey's will as witnesses, using the excuse that, being new in the area, they didn't know anyone else to ask. In fact, the police did have a copy of that will, but so too did they have several other copies. Within all the document stashes that they had been uncovering, they had found multiple copies of Ocey's will hidden all over the place. As the story spread nationally, more and more stories were also filtering back to New York from the south too, and they painted a rather peculiar story about the three sisters. Almost everywhere that they had been, they had a strong reputation for being eccentric at best and straight menaces at worst. Some suggested that Ocey had been forced to marry her cousin against her will. Alongside these more sensational claims, though, came a string of facts which helped to fill in their lives prior to New York. Caroline Martin was the eldest of the three sisters, having been born in 1845, followed by Mary Snead in 1848, and then Virginia in 1852. The Civil War had damaged the family's finances considerably, but all three sisters were well educated and well placed to recover, and all three became respectable teachers in good schools. Virginia had rose to the position of president in one of the best colleges in the whole South, and soon she had drafted in Mary as a teacher too, whilst Ocey attended as a student. Things seemed to be going quite well until Caroline Martin was brought on board, where she quickly gained a reputation for being a fierce educator with an unusual method of running the school's finances. Shortly after, Ocey was pulled from the school, supposedly due to a case of measles, but when it seemed to last for months on end, and rumours of a life insurance policy being taken out on her, people began to talk, and there were some whispers suggesting poison. Back at school, Caroline's mismanagement of funds and poor organisation was sinking the institution rapidly, and after an exodus of pupils, it was eventually forced to close down. One night in 1905, the whole Wardlaw family disappeared, leaving behind debts of $75 and a school in ruins. Mary Snead had chosen to travel to Georgia. Caroline and Ocey had moved to New York, whilst Virginia had moved to Christiansburg, Virginia, where she took over at Montgomery College, previously owned by her great-aunt. Just like before, the school thrived under her stewardship, and soon Mary was back in the picture, teaching there after moving to Virginia with her two sons, Fletcher and John. Caroline and Ocey arrived shortly after, and just as before, Caroline's peculiar teaching and organisational skills helped to quickly sink the school overnight. Meanwhile, Fletcher and John had opened a mill in Tennessee and were doing reasonably well for themselves, at least until Caroline showed up on their doorstep demanding that John leave the mill along with his pregnant wife and return to the failing school with her to work as a teacher. Naturally, John refused, but 2 weeks later, when Caroline returned, he capitulated and left with her, leaving his wife behind, who was very soon after placed in a sanatorium. John's life at the school was reasonably short-lived, as one day, whilst travelling with Caroline, he fell off a moving train. Whilst he actually managed to survive that accident, he was less lucky a little while later when he was found dead in one of the school's bathrooms one night after being set ablaze. It was officially concluded that he had been attending to a fire or that a gas lamp had exploded, but others suggested that his bedsheets had reeked of kerosene. When news filtered throughout the town that he had been heavily insured, rumours quickly circulated. Meanwhile, Ocey had married Fletcher and the three sisters were busy racking up more and more debt. Eventually, one by one, they had all left for New York, bringing the story up to date. As ever, Franklin Fort countered as many of these stories drifting out of the South as possible, providing letters between family members that he said showed quite different relationships and situations. He also pilloried both the public and the police for working themselves up into what he called hysterics. For the press, it was a sharply divided story. On one hand, there was scandal and intrigue aplenty, whilst on the other, there was a chivalrous defence of a proud old American family. Somewhere in the middle, the police and the courts were tasked with navigating this wild landscape. On Saturday, the 11th December at 9 a.m, Virginia Wardlaw found herself escorted back to the City Hall in East Orange, where she was to stand for her hearing to see if she could be released on bail. The Essex County prosecutor, Wilbur Mott, told the court that it was the official belief that if Ocey Snead had committed suicide, then it was down to some kind of hypnotic suggestion. Otherwise, she had been straight murdered. They called 12 witnesses, mostly covering the same ground, retelling the story of Virginia discovering Ocey's body in the bath. However, there were a few new voices too. A handwriting expert, William Kinsley, was called to give a statement suggesting that the pen used to write the body of the suicide note was not the same pen used to sign Ocey's name. Franklin Fort's rebuttal was swift and precise. The state has a note in evidence, but there has been no proof, nor even a hint of proof, that the note was not written by Ocey Snead. A handwriting expert has been introduced, but he is unable to say that the note was a forgery. The hypnotism evidence introduced by Dr. Petit is a farce, since he admits he knows practically nothing about hypnosis and has had little experience with it. It seems to me that a condition of hysteria has prevailed among the public and the authorities in the conduct of this case. Things seemingly peculiar have been discovered as to my client, but the prosecution, as the result of 2 weeks of effort, has failed to produce anything even dishonourable as to her character, her motives, or her acts. The evidence submitted has consisted of vague insinuations of crime. Until the state comes before you with some proof of the definite guilt of Virginia Wardlaw, you have no basis on which to hold her. I demand her release. Unfortunately, the court didn't take too kindly to Fort's demands, and they dismissed any chance of bail, committing Virginia back to her cell to await trial. Virginia left the courtroom without a word. With Virginia still remaining tight-lipped, the police instead turned their attention to uncovering the whereabouts of the mysteriously absent third aunt, Caroline Martin. They knew that she had been in the South up until October, but they also knew that she had been seen taking a train north. Tracing her history in New York, they discovered that she had been forcibly removed from her position as the principal in a public school in 1901 for being mentally incapacitated, and had ever since been paid $1,000 per month as a pension. Her old colleagues told the police that they remembered her as an intellectual but a little odd. Shrewd was a common word used to describe her. Most thought that she had shown signs of hoarder qualities and that she had obsessively collected old newspaper cuttings. The police also discovered that Ocey had had an older brother, but he had died at a young age from spinal meningitis, though rumours said he had fallen down the stairs. Her husband had been a Confederate war veteran and done well through the tobacco industry, with a mansion in Louisville that had burnt down shortly after he married Caroline, with the insurance paying out $22,000 for the accident. He later died of chronic cystitis when Ocey was a young teen, leaving Caroline with a $20,000 life insurance policy. Alongside all this information, the police also discovered that Caroline seemed to have a series of very strange inconsistencies to do with money. She was consistently seen begging for loans, whilst at the same time failing to cash her retirement checks until prompted by the school. All of this groundwork put in by the police eventually tracked Caroline down to a series of hotel stays in New York, where she appeared to be skipping from one to the other. She remained one step ahead of the police in this manner for several months, until finally the manager of the Bayard Hotel in Manhattan had grown suspicious of her behaviour and called the police. In a rush of excitement, both the police and a gaggle of press reporters flooded over to the hotel room and knocked at her door. Caroline, realising her bleak situation, refused to open the door, and when an enterprising journalist clambered up the fire escape, he burst into the room only to find it empty. In her rush to leave, Caroline had, however, left a black tin box behind, and when the police opened it up, they found a collection of suicide notes inside, all variations on the same theme, and all signed by Ocey Snead. A warrant was immediately issued for her arrest, and the police caught up with her in a 7th-floor room later that day. After a long, drawn-out investigation, the police now had 2 of the 3 sisters in custody, with a fairly promising stash of evidence to boot. The following day, Caroline Martin held a press conference, hoping to clear her name as publicly as she possibly could. She had been in hiding, she said, in order to evade arrest and buy her some time, whilst she could liquidate some property in order to pay for Virginia's legal fees. The suicide notes, she said, were all written by Ocey, who had obsessed about killing herself ever since her husband, Fletcher, had left, where she had written several notes threatening suicide over the months leading up to her death. If Ocey had suffered starvation, she said, it was because she had been trying to starve herself. She and her sisters were entirely innocent, she insisted. They had only been trying to care for her. Unfazed, the police spent the same afternoon arresting Mary Snead, bringing all of the 3 women in black into their custody. Meanwhile, police had been continuing to dig through the documents taken from Caroline's hotel room, and within they found a few that suggested Ocey's apparently dead husband may very likely have been alive and living in Canada. With the help of a few journalists, they tracked him down to St. Catharines in Ontario, where, to everyone's surprise, he was in good health, working as a chef in a hotel kitchen under the assumed name of John Lucas. The hotel owner then confirmed that a woman dressed all in black with heavy black veils had visited him sometime in June, somewhat begging the question that if Ocey was in such a state of despair due to her dead husband, why had none of her aunts told her that he was still alive? When police questioned Fletcher, he told them that he had fled New York in order to avoid being called to testify against an old family friend and a father figure to himself in a federal trial. The three aunts, he said, were surely innocent and had only lied in order to protect their family honour. With no reason to arrest him, police were forced to leave him in Canada, where he stayed and, as far as anyone knows, continued his life as John Lucas. Back in New York, and Caroline Martin was continuing her very public tirade against the prosecuting officials. She was now raging to the press about a conspiracy involving the insurance companies leaning on the police, even bribing them, in efforts to ensure that they would not have to pay out on their policies. She then took the unusual step of firing her legal counsel, Franklin Fort. Fort, in retaliation, came out and told the press that he thought Caroline Martin was insane. In fact, her mental instability, he said, had been a constant thorn in the side of the family for over 25 years, who had done everything in their power to hide the fact. Not keen on taking this scene down, Caroline's new lawyer, Robert Hare, alleged that Ocey had been a dope fiend and a habitual morphine user for over 2 years prior to her death. This, they now claimed, was the true motivation for her suicide. For the prosecution, who were watching this public fallout, things started spiralling into a progressively messy picture. Thankfully, back in the courts, the sisters' indictments were officially finalised on the 22nd of December, with all three being charged for murder. The prosecution had also hoped to charge them with accessory, but since that was impossible in a case of suicide, they were forced to drop that particular line. With all three sisters pleading not guilty, the trial date was finally set for the 11th of April 1910, and the police let out a sigh of relief that things seemed to finally be coming under control. Sadly, this wasn't to last, and a string of illnesses saw the trial pushed back and postponed several times, so that the three sisters were confined to jail for months on end, with no sign of a conclusion anywhere near the horizon. Of course, this was not a situation that made life easier for anyone involved, and soon the three sisters were making life difficult again for the prosecution. Rumours circulated throughout the prison that the sisters had entered into a suicide pact, and Caroline Martin was eventually moved to a cell far away from the other two sisters, as it was thought that she was having an overbearing influence on them. At the same time, Virginia had begun starving herself, hiding her food, giving it away to other prisoners, or disposing of it out of windows. Despite the best efforts of all the wardens to move her to a better cell and to feed her better quality food, she continued with this protest until she eventually succumbed, dying in prison. An autopsy showed that her starvation had been so severe that even if she had wanted to eat, her stomach was in such a state as to make digestion all but impossible. For the police, Virginia's death was a great blow to their cause, as she was the only person who had admitted to have been in the East Orange house when Ocey had died. At the same time as dealing with the fallout from Virginia's death, the prosecution were fighting on a second front, with Caroline Martin's new legal team making themselves busy securing affidavits from doctors that they hoped would prove that her mental health had deteriorated so much due to her confinement that she was no longer fit to help form a defence nor stand a trial. The court appointed 3 physicians to examine her, and a hearing took place where her legal counsel employed witnesses to show that she had unusual violent outbursts and fits of rage, even directed to her own legal team, who said that she had hid details from them that they needed in order to defend her case. Using witnesses that had known her since she was young, they painted a picture of eccentricity that had stemmed from a young age, and bolstered this image with evidence that she had routinely overpaid people for routine services, in one case employing a maid at $30 a month, when the average wage would have been closer to $2 a month. She never let anyone clean her room, they said, despite it being covered in old, rotting food, and she had a box of $5 and $10 bills that she would open and toss around the room just for the pleasure of throwing money. Throughout her life, they said, she had been a victim of what sounded like manic episodes, and her family had debated sending her to a sanatorium on multiple occasions. Throughout the entire hearing, Caroline continuously interrupted the proceedings, insisting that she was not crazy, that everyone was conspiring against her and bemoaning the northern states of America for their treatment of people. Whilst her outbursts caused laughter from many of the spectators, the judge was less amused, and by the time Caroline stood to give a long, incoherent, conspiracy-driven rant, his patience was hanging by a thread. At the end of the hearing, after several adjournments due to Caroline's ranting, 2 of the 3 physicians stood to give their evidence, concluding that they thought while Caroline had shown signs of exaggerated egotism, emotional irritability, impairment of judgment and delusions of persecution, impressing a peculiar and eccentric appearance, she was not in fact insane. Finally, after a month-long ordeal, the judge ruled Caroline fit to stand trial, with the date set for Monday, 9th of January, 1911. The morning of the trial was abuzz with excitement. Finally, after such a long period of inactivity, postponement and every twist and turn, the trial of the mysterious woman in black was set to begin. And then, just as everyone set themselves in for a long courtroom drama, Caroline Martin shocked the room by immediately withdrawing her not guilty plea and entering instead a plea of guilty of manslaughter. In a confusing scene, whereby Caroline seemed to disagree with her legal counsel, once more spiralling into rants about conspiracy, the defence finally assured the court that they had authority to confirm the plea on her behalf. In what was seen by many as a great anticlimax, the court was adjourned and sentencing scheduled to take place almost 2 weeks later, on the morning of the 23rd of January. Before sentencing could take place, however, Caroline Martin's legal team put forward an appeal for clemency, which potentially answered some questions as to what happened on the night of Ocey's death. Mrs. Martin has said that Ocey Snead was ill the night before she died and lay that night with her head in her mother's lap. She has since admitted that she had given Ocey morphine that night to induce sleep, as she had done on other occasions. When she saw how the drug had affected Ocey, she put the young woman in cold water in the bathtub in the hope of reviving her. When she finally realised Ocey's condition, she became greatly alarmed and went back to New York half crazed over the result of the treatment that she had given her daughter. The judge listened to the story and was not especially keen on affording the lady any leniency. It is probable that the entire facts leading up to this mysterious death will never be known. Neither you nor Mrs. Snead has ever made a full and complete statement at any time. From their own statements made in open court, it appeared that most of the information your counsel had as to the facts was derived from evidence in the possession of the prosecutor, and their theory as to how the death probably occurred was, as they stated, largely conjecture. There were, however, sufficiently undisputed facts to show conclusively that you were at least guilty of manslaughter. I am convinced that you have willfully refused to make a full statement of the facts to your counsel. Some of the more important facts in the case are the strange conduct and writings of yourself and your sisters during the period preceding your coming to East Orange, relating to your daughter, her illness, the large insurance upon her life, and your financial troubles. The knowledge which you say you had of a suicide pact between her and Mrs. Wardlaw, her frequent use of morphine, the strange disappearance of your daughter's husband, your knowledge, according to your own statement, that she was in a morbid state of mind and was engaged in writing a book to be called The Beautiful Suicide. Her writing of numerous suicide notes, many of which were found in your possession. The fact that you and your sisters brought your daughter to an unfurnished house in East Orange and kept her there for several days without proper food. The report by Miss Wardlaw of her death and discovery of her body by the police about 18 hours after the death, with one of the suicide notes pinned to her clothing. The futile attempt to create an impression that she had drowned herself while bathing, she having been then in a state of profound narcosis from morphine and unable to bathe herself. Your flight, taking the morphine bottle and hiding in various hotels in New York under different names. Your forced denial of having been in East Orange. The judge went on and on. Once again, Caroline Martin saw fit to interrupt him with a long rant concerning conspiracy against her, forcing him to adjourn the proceedings, reconvening later in order to complete his speech, where he sentenced Miss Martin to 7 years in the New Jersey State Prison, rolling until all costs had been paid. Her protestations of innocence could be heard throughout the court as she was led away to the police van and escorted back to prison, where she could expect to stay for the foreseeable future. The conclusion of the trial had not exactly been as the prosecution expected, and perhaps even more frustratingly, Mary Snead was now set to be released due to there being no accessory to manslaughter. Meanwhile, Caroline Martin put together a new legal team in the hopes of producing a viable appeal. However, nothing ever materialised. Now, wasting away in jail, her condition rapidly deteriorated, so that by the end of the year, she was noted to have been falling into regular catatonic states, alternating between feeble emptiness and violent manic episodes. Soon after, she was moved to the State Hospital for the Insane, which is where she died of heart disease on Saturday, 21st of June, 1913. Following Caroline Martin's death, the strange case of the East Orange bathtub mystery, as it came to be known, fell out of fashion off the back pages of the papers, only to be forgotten about for almost 20 years, when, in 1930, 3 diamonds and 2 diamond brooches were uncovered in a safe deposit box in the Murfreesboro First National Bank that apparently belonged to Virginia Wardlaw. Following her release from prison in 1911, Mary Snead had moved to Colorado, where she had taken up life on a ranch and had remained out of the public eye. Now, with this discovery of the jewels, she stepped back into the limelight in order to claim them for herself. At the same time, she used the opportunity to reinstate her and her sister's innocence, calling Ocey's death nothing more than a tragic accident. Whatever the truth, it would have died along with Mary, who, returning to her Colorado ranch, was not heard from again until her death 7 years later in 1937, the longest lived of the 3 mysterious women in black. So that was the twisting and turning story of Ocey Snead and the mysterious bathtub or the East Orange bathtub mystery. And we'll talk a little bit about that after these short advert breaks. Welcome back. So yes, as I said at the start, it's incredible how after all these years I can still sort of find myself just utterly perplexed and, thrown through all the twists and turns of new stories. Like I say, I sort of feel like I've seen it or read it all at this point. Apparently not. This story is, where to even start? I think you can say that there are probably 3 possibilities that we're looking at. Firstly, that Ocey did have a suicidal fascination. It was maybe not due to her husband leaving, like they said, but as they later mentioned, as the morphine addiction. So, I think that's the first potential, because I think there's a lot of other suggestions going on here, but these are the 3 that I think are potentially true. So the first one would be suicidal fascination due to a morphine addiction. I think we can say that's at least semi-realistic, and we'll come back to that in a minute. I think the second one is that Ocey was just straight up killed by her aunts for money, and I think that there's a lot of conjecture that we can have on that about the likelihood. And I think the third one is that it was perhaps manslaughter due to an accidental overdose or just sort of mistreatment. And I actually think that deserves some time. I do think that there's a potential. So to address that, there are some times where I do feel that they were caring for her. When you look at the evidence, they clearly weren't caring for her. But I suppose in their minds, perhaps they thought they were. At the very least, I think that this is manslaughter, right? And they're fully guilty of manslaughter. But it's just a couple of things which make me think this, right? Is that they did call doctors, even though they apparently didn't seem to have any money and were sort of desperately trying to find ways to pay these doctors. So they did go out of their way to call doctors in. what's weird is again, that this contradiction that's throughout this whole story is that they would call the doctors in, but then they would demand they go away, when the doctors started overstepping their boundaries, or they felt that the doctors were overstepping their boundaries. So there's that, but there's also the fact that, and it is a small fact, but I think it's interesting, is that Ocey was the only one that was given a bed. They slept on the floor. And if we do believe their prideful nature and stuff, them sleeping on the floor is, well, it's asking, a lot of someone, I guess, to just, essentially live like a squatter. That, I think, does suggest that perhaps they were looking after her. There's I didn't go into it, but so the statements, the good thing with this case is that almost everything, you can get transcripts of almost everything, which is great. The statements made by the women were just, they're not great. They never really gave anything that made sense and said a lot. But one thing that they did mention, I can't remember which one of the three it was, but one of them mentioned that basically, like, they wouldn't have killed Ocey because for them, Ocey was their sort of like new source of income. They were kind of, that they said that they were like training her up to be a teacher, so that they were then hoping that she would look after the family. So there's an element of that like, but how much do you believe that? And I think one of the things that's really important in this, I didn't quote directly any of Caroline's rants in the court because, frankly, they were, well, quite incoherent and difficult to follow. But you can certainly say that she was super smart. I mean, all of these women were very smart. Caroline, I think, was really, like, bitingly smart. She was very, very intelligent. Her outbursts during her sanity hearing were clearly sounded like paranoid delusions. And I definitely felt like she seemed to have these manic episodes. But she was also clearly smart enough to contort the truth. And especially during that hearing, I think she knew precisely what she was doing by sort of prolonging it and having these constant outbursts and making herself look ridiculous. I think she did that on purpose because I think she wanted to be given the insanity plea. Despite her constantly saying, I'm not insane. Her rants were, the conspiracy rants were quite mad. Interestingly, she did have some grounds for some of the conspiracy rants. So one of the things that she came out on and said that was this big conspiracy against her was by the life insurance companies. And she was saying, like, they're paying the police and they're leaning on the police because they don't want to pay out. They weren't leaning on the police necessarily, but they were helping in an investigation. They had their own private investigators and they weren't paying out, and they were specifically doing everything in their power not to pay out, like an insurance company does, right? She had some basis in truth, like that those rants had some basis in truth there, but she took it to another level and she was going right off on one about how it was like, it was a mix really of like, firstly she would sort of complain about men being like misogynistic against her and like, it was all a big conspiracy of men trying to hold an intelligent woman down and things like this, which was one of her kind of conspiracies. And another one was that it was, the northern states and the bad treatment of people from the south, and if she was in the south, then she would never have got this treatment and things like that. And so, I think some of this was to do with her paranoid delusions, and I do think she was quite unwell. But on the flip side of it, I think she also knew how to manipulate that. She was very smart. All of these people were very smart, which sort of really then leads you to ask, like, why were they treating Ocey the way they were? Because it does deserve to be said, I think, that that they really were treating her just horribly. Like, Ocey's death is absolutely horrible, and they were clearly responsible for this. Like I say, at the very least, I think you can say manslaughter. But yeah, I don't know which to believe, if it was manslaughter or murder. I think it was most likely murder. I think when you do look back on their past, I think Caroline had a long, long history of being a complete menace and messing things up. And I mean, there are even certain questions, certainly, like, you could have questions about one of her sons dying and being cashed in, the house burning down, her own husband, potentially. All of them raise questions. I'm not sure when it comes to murder, like, there are a lot of, so as I mentioned, in this case, there's a lot of transcripts and stuff, which is great. But there's also a lot of newspaper reports, and the newspaper reports are not reliable at all. They're really good to get a feel of the story and a feel of what was being said in the day. And, you get all the rumours and stuff, but they were full of like misreports and rumours. But two of the things they were suggesting was that they were keeping her drugged with opiates, or they were hypnotising her. The hypnotism thing was an interesting kind of side. I don't think that's the case. I think that's a kind of 19th century or early 20th century fascination with hypnotism, that they thought that might be possible. I don't think that's a likelihood. The opiates one, however, I think that is potentially true, especially when Caroline did give her speech at the end when she appealed for clemency, saying that she basically had given Ocey an opiate because she felt unwell and overdosed her, basically, and then put her in the bath and she had died. And then she sort of ran off because she was scared. I don't know, to me that's not completely unrealistic. That again goes back to the manslaughter charge, and I think, along with the other things that I mentioned, I think they're at least a credible defence. To be honest, I think that's her only defence, but I think it's a credible defence, and I think that's how she ended up with the manslaughter charge. But I think it's more nefarious than that, and I think when you look at their history, I think. And how intelligent they were, I just don't think. I think it was murder, and the one thing that really is sort of speaks out to that is Fletcher, her husband, Ocey's husband. The fact that they told her that he was dead, and he clearly wasn't, and at least one of the women in black knew that. I think that's an incredibly damning piece of evidence. That is actually true and not based on rumour or hearsay or little bits of conjecture here and there. That's actually solid fact in the case, and I think it's quite damning. That to me sort of pushes me towards the murder side of things. One sort of final, I guess, mystery and about this whole thing is, they never spoke about why they wore black with veils the whole time, like over the top black mourning outfits with heavy veils. I wondered if it was like a symbolic thing, like that showed like the death of their kind of family or something, the death of their family name or the death of their sort of wealth. I don't know, but they never explained that. No one ever did. They just seemed to wear these things for years, completely eccentric. Who knows? But there we go. If you have any thoughts about this episode, and I'm sure you do. If you would like to research more, like I say, the transcripts and stuff are readily available online, there's an awful lot of information about it. There's so much newspaper column inches to this story. It's unreal. You do have to be a little bit careful with that, as you always do with all newspapers. There's that, and there's transcripts, and there's all sorts. There is a couple of books as well, but there's so much information about this case. But I don't know whether or not you will come to any more of a conclusion as to, what happened than I just did. Really, it's a interesting story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to contact me, like I say, and let me know your thoughts, you can do so. My email is contact@darkhistories.com. Otherwise, all social media and stuff is in the show notes. It's also on the website at darkhistories.com. And you can also find ways to support the show there if you would like to have a Patreon with ad-free episodes, things like that. Otherwise, I think that's probably all there is left to say. So yeah, thank you so much for listening, as always. I'll be back in a couple of weeks. So until then, take care, sleep tight.